The Meaning of Marxism by Paul D'Amato. Section. Bought off? The race is to the bottom, not to the top. In the period after the Second World War, world capitalism entered an unprecedented economic boom. For a layer of workers, it seemed that 1930s-style poverty was a thing of the past. Workers could now expect that their children's lives would improve, and their children's after that. Radical ideas seemed unnecessary. Labor unions partnered up with the employers, trading economic benefits for their members in exchange for class peace. The Cold War anti-communist witch hunts, carried through by employers, the state, and the union bureaucracy, purged thousands of socialists and militants from the trade unions and other institutions, severing the connection between the radical traditions of the 1930s and later generations of workers. The tragedy is that the CP contributed to this process. To ingratiate itself with Roosevelt, it applauded repression against other radicals in the labor movement. When it was attacked and vilified by the state and in the unions, it failed to mount any defense. Party activists denied they were members, and some even participated in the red baiting. The post-war prosperity prompted a new battery of pundits to herald the end of socialism and the triumph of capitalism, giving rise to new arguments about how workers were too contented to want change. The claim was exaggerated, though it contained a grain of truth. But there were contradictions. The civil rights movement, and later the fight for black power in the North, was a stark reminder that the American dream never applied to African Americans. These social movements provided the impetus for the anti-Vietnam War movement, the women's movement, and the stirrings of a new labor movement. The endless prosperity came to an end in the late 1960s, shattering the post-war honeymoon. As crisis began to hit the U.S. economy, and as the social movements peaked, workers began to stir, bucking against both employers and a sclerotic labor bureaucracy that had become proud of its partnership with capital and looked upon picket lines with unease. The number of wildcat strikes doubled from 1,000 to 2,000 throughout the 1960s. A strike wave in 1970 included a strike by 40,000 miners demanding disability benefits, and postal workers, though legally prohibited from striking, organized a successful 2-week national walkout. In the Detroit auto plants, black workers organized the Dodge Revolutionary Movement and other similar organizations to fight racism and demand rights for black workers. Socialist ideas became attractive again to a layer of students and young working-class activists. There was a real possibility at this point to begin the process of rebuilding a militant, socialist current rooted in the working class. But there was a problem. The bulk of the radicalized activists were attracted to Maoist and Stalinist politics that turned their back on the working class as bought off, looking instead to third world national liberation movements for inspiration. Some left organizations did make a turn to the working class, but in the mid-1970s, economic recession hit, and, instead of provoking more working class rebellion, heralded the beginning of a retreat. The balance of class forces shifted decisively towards the employers beginning in the late 1970s. Unions, wages, and the social safety net were ravaged, while corporations fed at the state trough, courtesy of the working class taxpayer. As wages and unionization rates declined, there was a tremendous shift of wealth from the poorest to the richest, shown most dramatically by the 728-to-1 ratio of average CEO compensation to average wages in the United States. This economic offensive was backed up by a right-wing ideological assault that pinned the blame for poverty on the poor themselves. The 1980s became known as the looting decade. The collapse of what passed for socialism seemed another dagger in the heart of the left, already battered and demoralized by the Reagan era. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, writes Ahmed Shawki, quote, Western politicians and the mainstream press were celebrating the miracles of the market system and proclaiming the victory of capitalism over communism. The introduction to the 1989 edition of the Annual Economic Report of the President proclaimed, "The tide of history, which some skeptics saw as ebbing inevitably away from Western ideals, flows in our direction." End quote. But the excitement of capitalists and their spokespeople could not conceal the fact that their gain turned out to be a great loss for most people. Continues Shawki, quote, "The much heralded promises of Western politicians and business leaders at the time of the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in 1989 have given way to the stark realities of a global capitalist system." End quote. The stark reality was that in the United States and the rest of the world, inequality grew to staggering proportions, while a handful of people became very rich. Indeed, the period since 1989 has been one that Sharon Smith describes as the employer's offensive unhinged, with record profits accompanying a growing race to the bottom for the working class. Anyone who can argue today that the working class is bought off simply does not know what happened to the working class at the end of the last century and the beginning of this one. Income inequality, child poverty, and a widespread lack of access to health care are all more pronounced in the United States than in all other advanced countries. The minimum wage in 2005 was below what it was 50 years ago. According to one report, quote, "The wealthiest 20% of households in 1973 accounted for 44% of total U.S. income, according to the Census Bureau. Their share jumped to 50% in 2002, while everyone else's fell. For the bottom fifth, the share dropped to 3.5% from 4.2%. End quote. The very ferocity of the ruling class attack was bound to provoke a response. As Shawki notes, the, quote, "class inequality and social polarization that have accelerated over the decade of the 1990s form the underpinnings to a new radicalization." End quote. Yet that radicalization, emerging from a long period of defeat for the working class and the left, was at first slow in coming. As Shawki relates, quote, "While the collapse of Stalinism opened up the possibility of rebuilding a genuinely revolutionary socialist movement internationally, it also produced enormous demoralization and confusion within the existing left. Thus, in many countries, the immediate beneficiaries of the end of Stalinism were the defenders of capitalism." End quote. A strike by Teamsters in 1997 was one of many false starts in the return of working-class combativity, gaining popular support but failing to spark further class struggle. Then came the Battle in Seattle in 1999, the mass anti-war protest of February 15, 2003, in cities across the country, involving hundreds of thousands of people. And then the mass immigrant rights upsurge in spring 2006. In Los Angeles alone, 1 million people, mostly low-paid workers, many of them undocumented, formerly invisible, poured into the streets on 2 separate occasions in March and May to demand their rights. These were the stirrings of the most downtrodden sections of the working class that has for years not been able to see or feel its own power. The argument of today's pundits is not that the United States is different, but that the rest of the world is now as exceptional, that is, as closed to a socialist alternative, as the United States. In this depressing view, the United States provides the dystopian model: low wages, poor benefits, and inadequate social services that the rest of the world is bound to follow. This may be a model that capitalists salivate over, but for the majority, it is a model to resist. They are resisting, from Paris to Buenos Aires, from Los Angeles to La Paz. The single biggest obstacle to the development or the redevelopment of genuine socialist currents in the United States and elsewhere, Stalinism, is gone. And the claims of capitalism's great triumph looks like a cruel joke. In these conditions, genuine socialist ideas can once again spread and take hold. End of section.